And
Okay, good morning. Welcome back. If you notice, it's the same text as last week because we didn't finish last week. So we'll pick up where we left off. Paragraph number 5 near the end. Let me just give a brief synopsis of what we've done until now. Could you hear me?
Yes.
yeah.
Should take louder. Louder.
Maimonides is telling us about proper attitudes. And he introduces what people call the golden mean. Not going to extremes, but finding the midpoint between the extremes and behaving accordingly. That, he said, is a sign and the hallmark of a chacham, a wise person, an intelligent person, a person who has his head screwed on straight, will not tend to go to one extreme or another. But the chassid, the pious person, will bend, will go in another direction, away from the center, towards one extreme or towards the other extreme, depending on the circumstances. In other words, though it's wise to always be in the middle, sometimes one has to go beyond the norm. When you go beyond the norm, it's a sign that you're not just following a prescribed, very limited, rigid system, but you're really doing something because you appreciate the depth of what you're doing, and you're going, as the expression of the Talmud is, within the rule of law. So going to one extreme or another, not going all the way to an extreme, but tilting towards one extreme is a sign that you're doing something that is beyond your nature. And that's a very important principle in Jewish ethics that Maimonides subscribes to, that not always is it enough for a person to be good. A person has to strive to always go beyond their own limits. And that's the definition of a pious person. A pious person is someone who is always looking at what is the norm, and they're trying to go a little bit beyond that because they're really penetrating beneath the surface and appreciating the spirit of the law. That's the general idea that Maimonides was expressing until now. At the end of number 5, the last paragraph, Maimonides establishes that what he's just said until now is based on a biblical verse and it's part of a biblical commandment. If you remember, the emphasis of Maimonides throughout his works are the commandments. He's very much fixated on the 613 commandments, and wherever possible in his work, he will always tell you which biblical commandment is this idea based on. So he says, we are commanded to walk in these intermediate paths, and they are good and straight paths. As it says in Deuteronomy, you shall walk in his ways.
Okay.
We'll soon see how he uses that verse to establish the idea of going in the middle. But one thing is a little bit strange. Anyone who's familiar with Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, his major work that we're studying now, in his 83 sections of the entire work, he will always introduce the biblical commandment, the foundation of the subject, and then expound on it. He will tell you there's a commandment, let's say, to observe the Sabbath, and he'll tell you which commandments they are, and then he'll tell you what that means, what that entails. He'll talk about the laws of theft, fraud. He'll give you the biblical precedent, and then he'll explain and give you the details and elaborate on it. That's a very organized way of doing things. Give you the foundation, the source, and then expounding on it. But here, he doesn't do that. Here, he expounds on the idea, and after 5 paragraphs at the end, he says, you know what? This is based on a biblical verse. So the question that I've always had, why does he reverse the order over here? And I think the answer may be that Maimonides wants a person, if a person says, the only reason I'm doing this is because there's a commandment, that means it's not you doing it. It's being done by you, obviously, but it's being done by you because it's being dictated by someone else. Now, the someone else happens to be God, which is pretty good things to person to follow. Not a person, but of course, it's a good thing to follow God. But Maimonides wants to say when it comes to attitudes, you have to develop them within yourself and then recognize that there's a more transcendent aspect of it, which is the commandment. In other words, you have to develop the sensitivity to these ideas within yourself, because a human being is a creature that has to develop morals and ethics independently of the divine commandment. Now, it doesn't mean that you ignore the divine commandment. On the contrary, the divine commandment takes you to the next level. But as a foundation, you have to develop an attitude, and you have to recognize that the right path is the middle of the road, so to speak, and sometimes tilting a little bit in another direction. And then you recognize, you know what, this is based on a biblical commandment, and the biblical commandment adds new meaning to it and takes you to the next level. So when we talk about this commandment, you shall walk in his ways, how does that relate to taking the middle of the road? Where do we find God going in middle of the road, taking the middle path? If you want to go in his ways and you want to emulate God, we'll soon see how we emulate God in paragraph 6. Our sages taught the following explanation of this mitzvah, of this commandment. Just as he is called gracious, you shall be gracious. Just as he is called merciful, you shall be merciful. Just as he is called holy, you shall be holy. In other words, you're supposed to go in his ways and see what the Torah tells us about God's behavior and emulate that behavior. So how does that relate to taking the middle path? Where do we find that God takes the middle path? It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that God follows the middle path. But what we have to recognize is that God is the source of perfection. And therefore, if God is the source of perfection, and perfection entails taking the middle road, then obviously we have to emulate God in that regard and follow the middle path. Now, there's a question that's asked. Maimonides himself, in his Book of Commandments, establishes that when we count the 613 commandments, we only count specific commandments where the Torah tells you to do something. The Torah orders you to behave in a certain way or not behave in a certain way. The Torah commands you to give charity, for example. That's a specific commandment. It tells you exactly what it wants you to do. But there are many statements in the Torah that are very general. Be holy. Follow my commandments. Those are not included in the 613 because they are generalities. So the question is asked, and this question was addressed to Maimonides' son, actually. The question was asked to him, why does Maimonides count this commandment, and you shall walk in his ways, as a separate commandment? It's a very general statement. It's very general, so why is that included? That should be a separate category, not one of the individual commandments. And the answer is that this commandment tells you specific things. It tells you to be gracious, to be merciful. to be holy. These are specific actions. These are specific items. But that doesn't answer the question fully, because there is another commandment in the Torah: love your fellow as yourself. If you love someone as yourself, you'll be gracious to that person, you'll be kind and merciful. So that's already covered by the commandment to love your fellow as yourself. So why do we need another commandment to tell you in generalities, you shall follow in God's ways? The Lubavitcher Rebbe, the great sage of our generation, in his commentary, says that the specific commandment over here is that when we follow and we do these things, we take the middle of the road, we are gracious, we're kind, we do it with a specific objective to emulate God.
Right.
See, we can fulfill a commandment because we're told to do it. If the general tells the private, or whichever officer tells the private, I want you to do this, you do it because you're told to do it. That's what a commandment entails. What does the word commandment mean? That someone has the authority to tell you what to do, and that authority commands you to do something, and you do it. That's fine. That's great. But it's not enough. There's the commandment here is that whatever you do, that you're commanded to do, you do it because you want to emulate God. That's what God wants us. He wants us to become godly. This is a theme, a recurrent theme in Judaism in many different areas, that God created the world, the universe. He's the creator. So then 6 days of the week we work, and the seventh day we rest. Why do we rest on the seventh day? Because we recognize that God is the creator. But then why do we work 6 days of the week? Because God wants us to be his partners in creation. He wants us to be his partner. You honor your father and mother. It's one of the 10 commandments. Honor your father and mother. So the Talmud tells us that there are 3 partners in a human being's creation: father, mother, and God. When you honor your parents, you're honoring God vicariously.
What?
God wants us to honor him by honoring our parents. So there are many commandments in which God wants us to be godly. He wants us to he tells us to look at our parents as partners of God's partners, and so on and so forth. There are many other areas where God's desire for us is to become godly. When he created man, what does the Torah say? God created man in his image. A human being is created with a divine image. And that's a potential, of course. We have to live that way that expresses that divine image. That's why, if you ever notice, the 10 Commandments, 5 on each tablet. There's a joke about that when God offered the tablets, they asked, how much does it cost? And God says, there's no charge. He says, give us 2. Why do we have two tablets? You could have had all 10 commandments on one tablet. Why do they have to have 2 separate tablets? Because there are 2 ways of reading the 10 commandments. One is to read them vertically, 1 through 5, then 6 through 10. But then there's another way of reading it. 1 parallels 6, 2 parallels 7, 3 parallels 8, and so on. So what is the parallel? The first statement in the Jewish way of reckoning the 10 commandments, it's really 10 statements, but the first statement is, I am the Lord your God who was taking you out of the land of Egypt. What is the parallel to that? Don't commit murder. Why are they connected? Because when you commit murder, you're denying God, because the human being has the images created in God's image. Killing and destroying a human being is an affront, direct affront to God as well. Second commandment, don't have any other gods. That parallels don't commit adultery, because adultery is a betrayal of that relationship that God created. God created the relationship, the institution of marriage, and so on and so forth. Maybe you have another class to go through all 10 and show the parallel between 5 and 5. But the main point is that God wants us to express our divine image. And how do we express our divine image? By following in God's ways. So that's what Maimonides is telling us over here, that yes, doing the right thing is a good thing all the time. For whatever reason you do it. It's even better if you do it because you're commanded. It's following God's commandment. But there's an additional, a third point. So the first point is it's good because it's inherently good to follow the middle of the road. Number two, it's the right thing because God commanded it. Number three, it makes you godly. Another point, when we talk about the golden mean, so that sounds like moderate. Be moderate. Don't go to extremes. But there are two ways of looking at the golden mean. One way is to look at it as being moderate. You know, they tell the joke of someone who buys a thermos bottle, he returns it, he says it doesn't work. They said, why doesn't it work? He said, because they said that it keeps things cold and it keeps things hot. So I took my coffee and poured it into the ice cream, and the ice cream wasn't cold and the coffee wasn't hot. That's what happens when you mix two extremes. You get something lukewarm. It's neither here nor there. So we can't say that God wants us to be lukewarm. There's someone they had an expression that horses go in the middle of the road. People go on the sidewalks. In other words, animals follow the middle. Humans should be more capable of going to an extreme. So how do we reconcile that with the idea that we're supposed to go in the middle? And the answer is, going to the middle doesn't mean we compromise anything. It means we take the best of both extremes. That means in our mind, let's talk about the extreme of giving charity. I mentioned in an earlier class that Jewish law says you shouldn't give more than 20%. There are some exceptions, but that's a general rule. But your attitude should be, I want to give everything away. But that's not the right thing, because then it can cause other problems. But your attitude should be that extreme. So sometimes you want to have extremes, although you don't translate those extremes into action because it doesn't work out. It conflicts with other things, but you want to have that extreme attitude. You know, we use the word fanatical. Someone is a fanatic. Now, it's not a bad word. It depends on what you're fanatical about. If I'm fanatical that I will not harm a person, an innocent person, that's a good thing. If I'm fanatical that I want to help a lot of people, that's a good thing. So we have to be fanatical about values, even though we may have to moderate them because it may conflict with other values. That's the idea. We should never get the idea that we're supposed to be lukewarm. We're supposed to be hot in some directions and cold in other directions. Cold to evil. Be allergic to evil. So let's go on. In a similar manner, the prophets called God by other titles. They said God is slow to anger, abundant in kindness, righteous, just, perfect, almighty, powerful, and the like. Why are they describing God this way? God is neither of those titles. God does not have a title. God does not have a definition. Maimonides is very extreme about negating any type of description of God, because then you're making God into a finite being. God does not lack any quality, but he is not to be described by that quality. You can't say God is defined as kind or as love or any other attribute, but God identifies with those attributes. He created those attributes and he identifies with them. So why did God tell us, or the prophets who are speaking in God's name, that God has all these qualities? This is to inform us that these are good and just paths. A person is obligated to accustom himself to these paths and try to resemble him to the extent of his ability. We try to emulate God as much as we possibly can in all these different ways. So God is slow to anger, we should be slow to anger. God is abundant in kindness, we should be abundant in kindness. And how do we become that way? It's easy command someone to be kind, but if you're not a kind person, how could you become kind? So there are 2 points over here. Point number 1, how do you act kind? And point number 2 is how do you become kind, a kind-hearted person, if you're not? If you're born that way, people are raised and born that way, then they got a good upbringing and they're very naturally disposed towards kindness. But not everyone is like that. So how does a person who's not kind be kind? So you could say, well, they can't be kind, but they can act kindly. Yes, that's good enough for most people. Just behave in a kind way. That's the main thing. As I mentioned in an earlier class, if you had a choice of being a kind-hearted person, your heart bleeds when you see suffering and pain, but you do nothing about it. And you have another person who doesn't really care and doesn't feel bad about the suffering and pain, but they do something to ease and alleviate the suffering and pain. Which person would you rather have in your life? You'd rather have the person who acts kindly and compassionately than the someone who is compassionate but doesn't act that way. The world gets nothing from someone who doesn't act that way. So Maimonides wants to address both of these things. We have to develop the actions of kindness. I'm using kindness as an example, but it applies to all the others as well. You have to act kindly and you have to feel kindly, because in emulating God, you can't just emulate God in one way, that he acts kindly. You have to emulate God in the terms of the kindness that is associated with and ascribed to God as a metaphor. So the Maimonides continues in paragraph 7. How can one train himself to follow these temperaments, not just the actions, to the extent that they become a permanent fixture of his personality? So the answer Maimonides gives is a very simple answer. He should perform, repeat, and perform a third time the acts which conform to the standards of the middle road temperaments. He should do this constantly until these acts are easy for him and do not present any difficulty. Then these temperaments will become a fixed part of his personality. What he's saying here is the behavioral approach. And this is the essence of Maimonides' philosophy about the commandments. Human beings are physical beings. Yes, we have souls, we have a spiritual side, we have things that are not tangible about us, but we are essentially physical beings. And we are influenced by our own behavior. If you behave in a certain way, and you repeat that behavior over and over again, that will affect your personality. Maimonides, in another one of his writings, says if you have a choice of giving charity, there are 2 options. One option is that you can give, let's say, $100 in one lump sum, or you could give $1 100 times. Which is preferable? If I throw this question out to the audience, which is preferable, to give the same amount of money? The recipients will benefit the same way, but you can give $100 in one lump sum. You write out a check once a year for a large sum, very charitable, or you can give it in installments. Which is preferable? Does anyone want to venture? Yes?
Installments?
You say installments. Yes? Installments. Well, you're right. See, Maimonides had an effect. Everyone answered the right way. Maimonides says it's preferable to give it in installments. Now, I have to throw in a little bit of a qualification of that. If the poor person is starving and hasn't eaten in 3 days and says, could you please give me the money for a meal? You say, well, I'll give you $1, come back tomorrow, I'll give you another $1, and in 3 weeks you'll be able to buy a meal. Then by that time he won't be around anymore. Then obviously you don't consider which is a superior way of giving charity. The recipient determines what is the right path. But we're assuming that there is no difference to the recipient. You're giving to an organization, and the organization is, has to know that in this year we're going to raise so much money. My mind is it's better to give in installments. Why? Why is it better to give in installments? So he explains, because every act that you do that is charitable has an effect on your personality. The mere act of giving a little bit of charity, that changes your personality, imperceptibly at first. But if you keep on repeating it over and over again, it'll make you a more charitable person. If you just give one lump sum, it's easy for you to do, because you don't have to think anymore about helping, because I already helped. I already gave at the office. There's the famous refrain. Just to share 2 stories. There was a group of great rabbis, who were in a community, and they were discussing the needs of that community. And they were informed that there was a Jewish family that was languishing in a dungeon because they hadn't paid their rent for a year or so. And the landowner, the squire, was a notorious evil man. He had them thrown into a dungeon, and who knows if they would have survived. And the only way that he would let them free was to pay the amount of money that was owed. So these rabbis got together and says, let's draw up a list of all the people in this community who are capable of giving, and we'll try to raise the money. It was a large sum. So one of the rabbis said to the others, he says, why don't we go to Mr. So-and-so, whoever it was, who was the wealthiest man in town. He was not put on the list. So they said, we're not going to waste our time with him. He's the biggest miser in town. Anyone who comes to him for a donation, he has a rusty copper coin. And he gives you that copper coin, and people throw it right back at him in disgust. And no one ever goes to him anymore. This was what he did for years. And now nobody bothers to even ask him, why waste the time? You know he's not going to give you anything. So this rabbi says, if you're not going to go to him first, count me out. I'm not interested in joining you. And they said, but you're wasting a precious time. This family is languishing there. The rabbi says, look, you want me to be part of your delegation? He was the most effective in fundraising. You have to listen to me. Just don't say anything. Just come with me. And they go to this rich man's house. They knock on the door. He opens up and he looks and he sees a whole delegation of distinguished rabbis. He says, what do I owe this honor? And he said, so the rabbi says to him, we're here to collect money to save this family. They owe, let's say, 1,000 rubles, whatever it was. And the man says, I'll be glad to contribute. And he goes and he gets this rusty copper coin from his cupboard, and he gives it to the rabbi. And all the other rabbis are rolling their eyes. We told you so. And this rabbi, instead of throwing it back at him, says, thank you so much. You don't know what a mitzvah you just did. You don't know how precious every little donation is. And we greatly, deeply appreciate it. And the other rabbis are rolling their eyes and saying, why is he wasting his time? And have a nice day, and may God bless you. And they walk away. No sooner do they walk a few steps, this miser says, come back, Rabbi. I want to give you some more. And he gives them a small amount, but not just the copper coin. And the rabbi thanks him again profusely, and this repeats itself until he paid the whole sum. And the rabbi explained that this man had his power. Everyone has kindness in them, somewhere deep in their soul. The potential is there. But he never had the chance to exercise that quality. He was always, he was a miser, that's true. He wasn't a charitable person because that power of kindness was very deeply embedded in his personality. And he wanted to give something, but people threw it right back at him. So he never had the opportunity to give charity. So he remained this miser. As soon as we showed him that we really appreciated that he did a mitzvah, that he did something, every little bit counts. Never discount the value of even a small gesture. This opened up the well of kindness in him, little by little. And he became a kind and charitable person. The second story is a contemporary story. There was this woman who had no friends, had no social life, and she was miserable. And she went to different psychologists, and everyone gave her theories about her personality and what she should do, and nothing worked and nothing helped. Someone told her there's a great rabbi in Brooklyn, Rabbi Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that he is a brilliant man and he's a great, he understands human nature and he'll give you guidance. So she gets to see him, and the Rebbe, as he's called, says to her, do you ever eat in a cafeteria? Yeah. Well, when you're sitting at a table, offer someone to bring them some water. Have a good night. That was the end of the meeting. And she was so disappointed. I thought this man was a brilliant psychologist, that he's going to analyze my personality from a religious perspective. And here he just tells me to offer some water to someone. But she says, well, it doesn't hurt. And she offered some water to someone, and they said thank you, and she felt good about it. She felt good that someone appreciated what she did for them, and she kept on repeating this gesture, and her personality changed. And that was the cure. Sometimes the cure is very simple. Behavior changes personality, and that's what Maimonides is saying over here. Just one other point. The biblical commandment, you shall walk in his ways. That expression of walking in his ways is a very instructive term. There's a biblical reference to angels. What's the difference between angels and humans? They're both intelligent beings. They both have the ability to think. But there's a big difference. Angels that are described biblically as standing. They don't move from one place to another. They're fixed in their spiritual world. And even if they move, their movement is incremental. There's no jumping, there's no exponential changes, because that's the way they were programmed. An angel is referred to as an animal. Biblically, angels are spiritual animals. They're like robots. They're programmed in a certain way to have a certain spiritual mission. Human souls that are here in this world are described as travelers. We have the power. Only humans have that power. No other creature has that power, not even angels. To not only move incrementally, but we can jump, we can leap. We could change dramatically from one level to another. A human being could be the most horrible human being, and something could happen in his life, in her life, and they could change. And this has happened many times. People that we never thought of as being heroes became heroes. And sometimes it works the other way around as well, that sometimes what you think were good people could become not so good, but people who are average could become above average people. We have the ability to travel. So when God says to walk in his ways, he's saying to us, it's not just enough to do good things. You have to aspire to walk, to travel, to never be in one level. A human being has to constantly grow. And how do we constantly grow? Again, it goes back to action. The more actions we do that are positive, the more it reveals the infinite divine power that each human being possesses. Because we were all created in God's image, so we have divine power in all of us. And if we stay in one level, we're not exercising, we're not expressing that divine power. Then we're expressing our limited power, which is no different from an angel or from an animal. But when we act godly in a godly way, and when you emulate God, we elicit that divine power that enables us to jump and to leap from one level to a totally higher level. Human beings have this infinite power if they exercise it. If we have the free choice. We could choose to remain very much on one level, or we could jump and leap.
Great. Thank you.
And Maimonides concludes this chapter. Since the Creator is called by these terms, and they make up the middle path which we are obligated to follow, This path is called the path of God. Now, why is the middle of the road? I started to explain why it's called the middle path, the path of God, because it's the sign of perfection, and God is perfect. But let me go a little bit deeper into that. What's unique about a human being is we have knowledge. Knowledge means that we have the ability to discern between different things. A human being could go from one extreme to another. A person could be kind, and they could be harsh and judgmental. And we can go from one to the other. We have to have the power of discernment to know when to be kind and loving and when to be stern and judgmental. Human beings have that power. That's the power which in Hebrew is called das, knowledge.
Yeah.
And there are different intellectual powers that we have. There's generally three intellectual powers. There's Chochmah, which is wisdom, the idea to conceive of an idea. There's Binah, which is to develop an idea, to build on it, to analyze it, to draw inferences. And then there's Das. Das is the ability to discern. When the Sabbath is over, there's a prayer called Havdalah. We establish the separation between the Sabbath and the weekdays. And it's recited within another prayer where we ask God for das, for knowledge. And the Talmud says if you don't have knowledge, you can't separate, you can't discern. Discernment is the power of knowledge. And that's what Maimonides is telling us, that God is the ultimate source of knowledge. God is not limited to one form, one trade or another trade. He's able to combine different attitudes and know when one attitude applies and when the other one applies, when to limit one's attachment to one approach and embrace another approach. For that you need a divine endowment of knowledge. And that divine endowment of knowledge was given to every one of us. We are all capable of making that discernment, when to go in this direction, when to go in that direction, and when to stay in the middle. Any questions? Going back to charity, just to, it's always better to give in installments, but there's an advantage to giving in one lump sum as well, because then the quantity has an advantage. So how do you reconcile those two imperatives, to give a lot or to give it in installments? The answer is to do both. Give one big lump sum, and then give another smaller amount and give in installments. There's another contradiction about charity. In one source, it says that charity should be given secretly, anonymously. So I never sign my checks. No, it says to give charity anonymously because then it's done with humility and you're not showing off. In another source, it says you should publicize what you give to encourage others to give. If there's a group of people and you say, I'm giving $1,000, other people who have a lot of money will say, I can't give less than this guy. This guy isn't so rich. You'll encourage others to give. So what do? There are two contradictory imperatives. You have two extremes. The answer is, give a large amount publicly and give another amount anonymously. There's an easy way. That's what you need knowledge to figure out how to reconcile contradictions, because they're not really contradictory. There's room for both, but you have to know how to balance that. That's the power of das, of knowledge, and that's what gives us the advantage over any other creature, that we have that power. This was not an appeal.
But,
Yes.
I think what the interesting thing is, if you see these commercials a lot of times where they're trying to get you to give to a certain charity. And they say, you know, what, this would only be $1 a day. You know, they say, you could pledge $30 or whatever, but it'll only be $1 a day. And I think people have an attitude that if it's only $1 a day, well, I can afford $1.
Right.
I think they're trying to, you know, use psychology there to
Okay.
make it seem, even though you have, you know, they expect you to give.
Right, it does work.
But they want you to think of it in terms.
But what Maimonides is saying, that it's preferable to do it that way, not just because it makes it easier for you to give, but because it makes you give more often, more frequently.
Yeah, and if giving makes you, you know, if you're cheerful when you give, if you are giving more frequently, you're going to be
Right.
more cheerful.
I'll share another little story. There was a rabbi in Jerusalem who was sitting with the students, and someone comes in and asks for a donation. It's a poor person, and he gives them a very nice donation. After he gives them the donation, he sends one of his students, "Can you please bring him back?" And he gives him another donation. So the students thought nothing of it. He probably realized that he didn't give him enough, so he called him back. But then this repeated itself. Every time someone came for a donation, and in Jerusalem there are a lot of such people, he would always give a nice donation and then call them back and give another donation. So they asked him, "Rabbi, why don't you just give the full amount right away?" So you probably are thinking he probably would answer, "I want to do it repeatedly." No, that was not his answer. He said, "The first time I give charity, I feel bad for this person. It makes me feel bad that this person is in dire straits. So I give him money to alleviate my own pain. I wasn't giving it for him, I was giving it for me. Once I get rid of my own pain, now I'm giving it for him." So the second time is more idealistic than the first time. Yes?
Same man goes home and tells his wife about having given all this money. When the wife informs him that they don't have enough and she just lost her job. So there are so many complications in life.
Yeah.
Making a decision here, you know, we can probe ourselves, but you never know what impact it may have on others too.
Right. So let's be godly and imitate God. That's the message of Maimonides.
And good.
On it.
Gotta be.
Good message.
Okay?
There's